forecast for the Latin America situation? I mean, economic and also for the social situation.
Well, even 8 months ago, we were saying things like, the economy looks great. Christine Lagarde, my good friend at the IMF, was saying, when the sun is shining, it's time to repair the roof. But the sun is not shining so brightly for the entire world economy. We see most of the risks on the downside. We have reduced our estimates for global growth, and that includes Latin America. There are lots of opportunities. There's so much uncertainty right now, trade tensions between China and the United States. And one of the things that happens when there is that kind of uncertainty is that the investment rates go down. And so investment overall as a percentage of GDP has gone down throughout the world. And many people are sitting back and sort of waiting to see what happens. In fact, many people are waiting to see what happens at this meeting in Buenos Aires. There will be meetings between President Xi and President Trump. And so, we're worried because what can happen is that in a period of uncertainty, and as the U.S. Fed, they've signaled that there's going to be one more increase in the interest rate this year. We're not sure how many there will be in the next year, whether there are two, whether there are three. There were some signals today that may have suggested that the rate of increase of interest rates will go a little bit slower than we had thought. But what can happen for Latin American countries is that when there's uncertainty and when the Fed funds rate is going up, access to capital could become more difficult.
Yes.
And that's true for Latin America, it's true for Argentina. But there are many things that Latin American countries and also Argentina can focus on right now. Getting solid, stable macroeconomic frameworks so that you give, not only do you do the right thing for the economy, but you give confidence to the rest of the world. That's very important. This is also a really good time to think hard about how well Latin America has been investing in its people. We just published a human capital index. And so while we're worried about what might happen because of uncertainty, because of the potential of the Fed funds rate that will lead to difficulty in accessing capital markets, we think that the need for reforms, just the kind of reforms that Argentina is undertaking, are necessary throughout the region.
How is your opinion about the US and China situation? You told me about that, and what are the main expectations you have about that?
We don't know what will happen. If you want to ask, why do you do a G20 meeting, right? I think one of the best reasons is because it forces ministers of finance, central bank governors, and heads of state to get together at least once a year. The only other time where heads of state gather is at the United Nations. And so having this kind of situation where there's enough time so that leaders like President Xi and President Trump can get together, this is an extremely important function of the G20. And we're now at the 10th anniversary. It really got started again in 2008 during the financial crisis, and now it's been 10 years. And so we don't know what will happen between the two, but what we do know for sure is that those kinds of tensions, the talk of trade war, is not good for the world, certainly in the medium and the long term. Now, there may be some opportunities, maybe even some opportunities for Argentina with the tariffs and the trade tensions, but that's really in the short term. In the long term, these kind of tensions are not good for anybody.
And what are your expectations about the G20 experience? I mean, the local experience.
Well, on the one hand, I feel like on behalf of all the participants of the G20, we should apologize to the Argentine people because it creates such a huge logistical nightmare. On the other hand, I think to see the 20 of the most powerful leaders in the world all coming to
Yes.
Buenos Aires and getting a much deeper understanding of what's going on here in Argentina is a very, very good thing. I mean, I think it should be a source of great pride that Argentina can handle something of this magnitude. It's not easy. It's probably the most complex event that happens in any given year, to have that many heads of state coming to one place where we're talking about difficult issues. It is very complicated, very difficult, and because it moves. In New York City is the other one where the heads of state come together for UN, but they've done it every year for 70 years. The fact that it keeps moving and that Argentina now has to step up and do something that is so complicated, I think should be a source of great pride.
And what's your opinion about the situation, the social situation in Latin America?
Well, during the commodities boom, that when China was just absorbing so many commodities and was growing so quickly, Latin America did some really wonderful things. It reduced inequality. Now, the inequality in Latin America is still the highest in the world, yes, but it reduced inequality, and it also created a middle class. It expanded the middle class in really historic ways. So I think the most important thing now is that in this period where things are going to get more difficult, there are several processes happening. There are the trade tensions, but there's also sort of the end of the business cycle. That we've gone now for 10 years with relative expansion, and so at the end of the business cycle, what's going to happen next? Well, nobody knows for sure, but Latin America really needs to now look and say, our success in reducing poverty, our success in reducing inequality, our success in building the middle class, we cannot go backward. And so if you look at our lending to Argentina, I mean, we've put together a program of $3 billion. We've scaled up our support for Argentina very, very quickly. More quickly in Argentina than in any other country that I've been involved in 6.5 years of being president of the World Bank Group. And the reason we've done that is because we believe in this administration, we believe in the reform process, but also out of the $3 billion that we're providing in these few years, $2 billion is to protect the poorest, is to protect those who could really be hurt the most in the context of the kinds of reforms that are happening. So I think it's extremely important for every Latin American country to take pride in the accomplishment of reducing inequality and building the middle class. But in periods of economic difficulty, rich people can always protect themselves. And now we have to protect the poor.
What's the importance of that middle class? I mean, why is it so important to build a huge middle class?
Well, if you build a middle class, the hope, first of all, it's just a good thing that people are not living, as part of what some people have called the precariat. Yes. The proletariat and precariousness put together. And there's just so many people who are now part of what some have called the precariat. And so the middle class, the hope is that they're now less in less of a precarious situation, and that's just a good thing to do. But I think another way of looking at it is if you look around and say, okay, so in Latin America, so much of the growth has been based on the export of primary commodities.
Yes.
It has to now go down a different path. So if you have a growing middle class that has much higher aspirations for their own children, for better education, for different kinds of education, maybe going into science, technology, engineering, and math, that's where the growth is going to come from in the future. So, I was just in China, and I went to one of the poorest provinces where they reduced poverty from 30% to 8% in just 5 years, Guizhou, right?
And how?
They did it, they're an almost purely agricultural province. And what happened was Alibaba and the government came in together. They both provided very focused subsidies. And what was a very poor province became an e-commerce mecca. It became a quote-unquote Taobao village. And you saw, I met people who had gone away to work in larger cities along the coast. They came back once the Taobao village was established and are now making 10 times the salary, exporting kiwis from Guizhou to Europe, right? Now, is that possible here in Argentina? Absolutely. And to get back to the original point, you need a middle class with high aspirations, looking out in the world, looking at new forms of economic growth. That's what is going to be, I think, the future of Latin America. Latin America has invested a lot in education over the past 10, 20, 30 years, but the outcomes haven't gotten much better. So if you focus on saying, we've got this middle class, what can we do now to create new forms of economic growth so that there will be dynamism and enough growth so that you can continue to raise people out of poverty, give people more opportunity and hope for the future.
And is it the education way the best form to improve equality in Latin America and globally?
Well, you know, we've in our annual meetings in Bali in October, we launched something called the Human Capital Index.
Yes,
The reason we did it is because I'm a medical doctor. I've been an activist. You know, I think I told you before. Say, you know, 20 years ago, I was part of a movement called 50 Years is Enough, and we were trying to close the World Bank and IMF on their 50th anniversary, which is 1994. Right? But since then, my view on this, of course, has changed completely. But you know. The reason we were so critical of the World Bank and IMF was because they thought that the ideology, at least for many people in the institution, was that you invest in health and education after you've become rich. First grow rich, then invest in health and education. We were arguing back in 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that that doesn't work. The countries that have gone from being poor to middle income to high income countries have invested in their people before institutions like the World Bank thought they should. And so there have been a lot more investments in health and education. There's a lot more official development assistance. But what's been happening is that that heads of state and ministers of finance have been investing in health and education after everything else. So first build the roads, get the electricity, do the kind of heavy infrastructure that everyone can see. Health and education, we all say it's important, but there's not any immediate punishment if you don't invest in health and education. So what we wanted to do was to just reveal to everybody how closely health and education outcomes are correlated with economic growth. And so we did some extensive work, and we just took 4 factors: childhood stunting, under 5 mortality, adult mortality, and then something we're calling learning adjusted years of schooling, right? Based on tests, based on the tests that are given in all these countries. And what we found was that Argentina is ranked number 62 out of 157. Yes. So it's number 2 in South America. Chile is higher, ranked number 45. So that's not bad. Right? But without investing much more aggressively in higher quality health and higher quality health interventions, higher quality education, it will be difficult for Argentina to compete in the economy of the future, because China, South Korea, Indonesia, all the East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asian countries are very much aware that investing in health and education is really what's going to lead them to be able to compete in the future. Latin America has to follow suit.
And do you think populism can return to countries such as Argentina?
Well, you know, we were just in a meeting with the Council of the Americas, and I pointed out that these ideological arguments about, you know, should we be capitalist or should we be socialist, and you know, should we opt out of the global market capitalist system and then just do things our own way? You know, those are such academic arguments. You know, I was a president of a university, and we have those arguments inside the seminar rooms. You know, but the good thing about that is that those arguments in the seminar rooms don't ever get translated into policy. Here in Latin America, often it becomes policy. And what we've been trying to say is, you know, if you want to understand how the rest of the world thinks about the global market capitalism, look at some countries that are actually communist countries, China and Vietnam. You know, my conversations with the Chinese and the Vietnamese are never about socialism versus capitalism, right? Those are socialist countries. But they understand that in order to grow the economy, lift people out of poverty, create jobs, they have to figure out how they can insert themselves into the global market capitalist system most effectively. So when I meet with the leader of the Communist Party of Vietnam, he wants to talk to me about global market capitalism and how they can more effectively manage their own industries, of how they can, for example, bring new ideas from the outside, of how to reduce the burden of state-owned enterprises that are losing money. This is what they talk to me about. And it's only in countries like Argentina where we have these completely almost disembodied debates that are completely unconnected to the reality of the world outside.
It's like old-fashioned.
Well, it's not just old-fashioned.
Yes.
It's disconnected
Yes.
from the reality of the world, right? So I'm a medical doctor, and one of the things that I said immediately to my teams when I came to the World Bank Group is, I need to learn from all of you about finance, about macroeconomics, and I hope to be a very engaged student. But one of the lessons I want to bring from medicine is evidence-based approaches to whatever we do. What is the evidence, right? So you can have as much ideology as you want, but the reality of it is, if you do crazy things, if you don't have a sound macroeconomic framework, if you start nationalizing companies, if you do crazy things, the market will respond. And you'll have incidents like, the borrowing costs for Argentina can go up 60%, right?
Yes.
You see, this is what will happen. And so what I would like to say to the Argentine people is, yes, go ahead and have these arguments, but bring some new data and information into your discussion. Look at what's happening in China. China has just about every new form of new path to economic growth. It all exists in China. AI-based, robotics-based, e-commerce-based, it all exists in China. But 2 years ago, Premier Li Keqiang came to me and said, I want you to do a study on new drivers of economic growth for China. So we then, and they were the first country that asked us to do this. We looked all over the world at different paths toward economic growth and then did a study of how China could take advantage of those, right? This is what's needed here in Argentina. What the argument seems to be, we need to divide up the spoils, and we need to divide it up. But if you're dividing up the spoils of an economy that's shrinking, right, that's going to be bad for everybody. Argentina, just like every other country in the world, has no choice. President Xi said, the global market is the vast ocean we all swim in. You can't avoid it, you can't get out of it, and you can't stop the flow of trade, of ideas, of people, of capital. This is what the president of the largest communist party in the world said. And so that's just the reality, and I would hope that conversations in Argentina and elsewhere would be less ideological and more evidence-based. People have passion about protecting the poor, so do we. And the question that we would ask is, so what's the evidence of how best to do that? 1, sound macroeconomic framework. 2, a business environment that attracts private capital, that leads to job creation and economic growth. And 3, policies that actually protect the poor, including better health, better education, better social protection programs, all the things that we're trying to do everywhere. It's about evidence, not ideology.
What are your local plans for Argentina?
Well, so we are, as I said, we have a $3 billion portfolio. It grew faster than any other portfolio I've ever seen. And again, it's because Argentina is so important for the regional economy, so important for the global economy, and we believe in the reforms that are being undertaken. And so part of it is improving the business environment, part of it is protecting the poorest, and we continue to be very involved in providing advisory services as well. And probably, I think, our most important role. There's so many very bright people who have global experience, very bright people who know the Argentine economy better than I ever will. What we do have, though, is we have experience in just about every country in the world. Every developing country in the world, we have something going on, just about every country. And so what we can do is to bring experiences, bring programs, bring approaches from all over the world, and to see if it can work here in Argentina. And that's what's needed. Argentina has to, it was the most closed economy in the world. Now is the time to open up and say, Wow, in terms of natural capital, natural resources, oh my goodness, there's very few places that have more natural capital than Argentina. Human capital, very, very good. 4 out of the 6 unicorn companies, in Latin America are here in Argentina. 5 Nobel Prize winners. So many great assets in Argentina. The biggest problem is if Argentina looks inward and has this theoretical argument, disconnected from the reality of the world, and then makes choices, bad choices once again, and it would be such a tragedy because we know what happened in the past when those bad choices were made.
We know the end of the story.
Absolutely.
What do you think about the corruption cases that are happening here in the region? I mean, Brazil and Argentina. What's your opinion about that?
Well, at the World Bank Group, we have a very clear policy. But let me give you a little bit of history. In 1996, when Jim Wolfensohn, one of my predecessors, was going to give his first speech to the annual meeting, he told the vice presidents, I'm going to talk about the cancer of corruption. Right? And the vice president said to him, you can't say that. And Jim said, why can I not say, what do you mean I can't say that? He said, well, so many of our countries are corrupt that if you say cancer of corruption, that we won't have anybody to lend to. Right? So, just 22 years ago, it was accepted that this corruption was just part of doing business in developing countries. And under Jim's great leadership, he said, no, we'll have zero tolerance for corruption. So we follow our money very, very closely. Right? But does corruption still happen? Yes. Corruption happens to happen in every country in the world. There's no high-income country that doesn't have corruption. It's always existing. But I think that efforts that President Macri and his team are making to increase transparency, even utilizing information technology to increase transparency, it's very important. If you look at examples like in India, they have put more than 1 billion people on a unique identification system, 10 fingerprints, 2 iris prints, and a 12-digit number. And now they're moving money directly from the central government into people's individual accounts. And they have prevented something like $20 to $30 billion in payments that were diverted. They've eliminated a great deal of the corruption in those direct payment systems to the poorest. So there are many ways to do this. We just need to see the commitment on the part of central governments to really tackle corruption. I mean, I think the results in Brazil, speak for themselves.
Yes.
He was, President Bolsonaro was an unexpected candidate, but because of his stance on corruption, he seemed to have, attracted a lot of support. So I think it used to, my predecessor Bob Zoellick used to say, corruption is just simply a way of impoverishing poor people further. Right?
I know we are out of time, but the last question is about the global situation. Do you think that with the huge global divisions that are now happening around the world and that we are suffering, is it possible to solve it with multilateralism?
Well, I think that multilateralism is one of the great inventions in human history. And it happened after World War II. And, our institutions in particular, while World War II was still going on, a group of about 40, 45 countries got together in a hotel in New Hampshire and sat down and had 2 issues in mind. One was, that prior to the establishment of the IMF and the World Bank, currency wars were happening everywhere. The beggar thy neighbor policies, where people would try to manipulate currencies, that happened everywhere. So the gold standard and the stability in currency and exchange rates was part of what came out. But the other part was the World Bank Group, and we were founded to rebuild Europe. Right? But then the Marshall Plan came into place, and then quickly we started focusing on other areas. I keep saying, if you get rid of the multilateral system, you'll just have to invent it again, right? Where else, would you be able to tackle the most, difficult issues in economic development? The IMF plays such a critical role in times of crisis. And the UN, as much as people criticize the United Nations, you have to have a place where everyone can go and talk about things like the war in Yemen, talk about things like, Syria. You have to have these systems. We can always get better. and we're trying very hard to get better. But I don't think there are better options than the multilateral system in tackling the most important issues. Then the G20 is a multilateral mechanism, and again, everyone is now watching the Buenos Aires meetings very closely, because we're hoping that that we can chart a path forward that will be, what's the right word, that will lead to a situation where everybody wins. And we're not quite sure how that will happen, but I'm going to be in those meetings. I'll be watching very carefully. I know that a part of the G20 is that these leaders get to know each other. They all call each other by the first name, right? We can't call them by their first name, those of us who come, but they all call each other by their first name, something that you don't see very often. And our hope is that these relationships that have been built up over the years will lead to some better outcomes after this weekend.
We hope so. Thank you very much. Great pleasure to
Thank you,
interview.
Jose.
Thank you very much.
Unidad de galletitas dulces, conservas de pescado y tomate, y en marcas seleccionadas de capilares y jabón para la ropa. Además, 35% de descuento en juguetería y muebles de exterior. Jumbo, te da más.
La Nación presenta Lego Fan Fest por primera vez en